Welcome to another Bible prophecy video with Pastor Tom Elseroad. Have your Bibles ready as we dig deeper into God's holy word.
Father, thank you for this evening. Thank you for the beautiful day, and we just pray that our time together tonight will be one that honors you, and we're just realize how well you have everything planned out for the future and even in the past, Father. So we just thank you to know that, and just ask that you keep our hearts and minds clear and not think about other things but your word. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. Okay, so we're in chapter 8, so we're moving right along. And so we'll see these guys a little bit later on as we go into study. Where we are in the outline itself, of course, now we're into the last section, which is the part that is now back in Hebrew. Remember the first chapter, the first 4 verses basically of chapter 2 was all in Hebrew, and then all this section we've been reading about all these visions and dreams and all that was in the Aramaic, and of course that was talking about Gentile kings, and now we're getting back into the Hebrew section again. I know in our Bible it was all English, right? So we can't tell there was ever a distinction there, but it was there. So we're now in chapter 8 again, the last section being in a different language. I hear something. Okay, so let's just start a couple of things. There's a lot here, so I'm going to try to go through this, and hopefully it all makes sense. There's a lot of detail. This is one of those it gets a little bit more, not a narrative anymore. It's more instructive, and he's seeing visions, and he's trying to figure out what it all means and all that. So this vision was given. Remember in chapter 7 there was a vision last week that he had, and it concerned him, and he's trying to figure out what it all meant, and then he gave the interpretation, so he has some idea. Now this is about 2 or 3 years later. Here in chapter 8, he's going to have another vision here, and so remember all these visions are actually time-wise during the time of the Babylonian captivity, or Babylonian while Daniel's in Babylon, while they're in charge of everything, really. And so that's what's going on there. So even though he's talking about things that's going to happen in the future, this is all from Daniel's time. It's actually while he's in Babylon. Daniel 7 considers the 4 world empires. Remember the 4 images, the 4 creatures, and we'll see those again a little bit later as well. Chapter 8 is going to be about what's happening as the second and the third of those 4 creatures, those 4 nations. It's going to be about Medo, Persia, and Greece, which would be the nations right after Babylon. Okay, and so what that looks like here is... Remember, this was back in chapter 2, and these are the order of the events. Babylon, Medo, Persia, which we're talking about today, Greece, and they'll come up again in another place, but Medo, Persia, Greece, Rome is it. It's interesting that Rome is unspecified. You know, clearly the text says that Babylon, you are the head of gold, okay? He said that, and he'll tell us that Medo, Persia, and Greece are the next 2 creatures. So last week we saw those the 4 beasts, right? And they corresponded to the image itself. So the head was the same as the lion with the eagle's wings, and the Medo Persian was the silver there was the bear with one side lifted up higher than the other side. Greece is going to be like the leopards with the wings, 4 wings, and those are all important. And then we get to this one here. It never says it's Rome. It just doesn't actually specify that. And that's chronologically how it happened. But there seems to be more reason to challenge that historical view. Let me just open that can a little bit. That it may be something other than Rome, even though chronologically that's how it happened. And I'll show you a little bit of why. When we get to today, we're in chapter 8, so it's going to talk about the ram, which has 2 horns, one larger than the other. Again, just like the bear with one side lifted up higher than the other. Same idea, again, referring to Medo Persia. And then the goat, it's emphasizing the one horn here. And the one horn, ultimately, that's actually talking about Alexander the Great. So you can go back and read about him. And then when he died, it split up into 4 kingdoms, or the 4 generals, basically. We'll talk about that as well. But chapter 8, and then mostly in chapter 11, it's going to talk about Antiochus Epiphanes. And it becomes interesting because out of the goat, right, the third one here, Greece, is this Antiochus Epiphanes, and he becomes a picture of the Antichrist. I'm just kind of giving you a quick overview here. But there's something about that, like it doesn't really say a lot about, really Rome at all. In fact, when I brought this together, in fact, I had a handout. I was going to hand that out for you. This chart here. See, when I look at the fourth kingdom characteristics, and because there's a lot of debate over who is the fourth kingdom, it doesn't say it's Rome. It's just traditionally been considered Rome. But I went through where in chapter 2 it talks about the fourth kingdom. What does it say about it? Chapter 7, all these different visions and all this stuff. And chapter 8, today, and what it says about the kingdom coming up. And then chapter 11, you're going to see that, there's characteristics here that don't make sense that it's Rome. And some of these makes it very, very hard to understand why. We've always said that traditionally, in Daniel 7:24, for example, a kingdom alliance. And so we talked about the fact that it talked about 10 toes, right? And 10 toes, and so we say, well, what are those 10 toes? Well, we think they're the 10-nation confederation in the future, and still do. I mean, that makes perfect sense. But is it really because it's a part of Rome, or is it some other kind of organization becomes the question. So I'm not going to overwork this, although I think I could spend the entire lesson just on this. Just looking at the verses related to the characteristics of that fourth kingdom. Again, that Babylon's easy, and the Media-Persia is easy, and Greece is easy because it clearly says that that's what it's referring to. But Daniel was always concerned with trying to figure out who's this fourth nation. He said it was different than all the others. And he gives characteristics about it that don't make sense that it's actually Rome. For example, it talks about being a divided kingdom in Daniel 2. Well, Rome wasn't really a divided kingdom. I mean, they were a monster kingdom and very powerful in a lot of ways. But there's characteristics here that I'll just leave the door open, that it might refer to something other than Rome. I don't think it changes our eschatology, but it does help us. It may change the way we view Daniel and looking at it from the past, really. So let me just dive right in. And there's 27 verses, I believe, in chapter 8. In the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar, again a Babylonian, during the time of the Babylonians, all these visions came out. A vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that appeared to me the first time. The first time is referring back to chapter 7, and that was about 2 or 3 years prior to this one. So he remembers that there was a vision there, and now he gets another vision a couple years later. Not like these having visions all the time. There was a couple years of time in between. So the Lord gave to Daniel this prophecy, but again, but this time it was in the form of a vision. In chapter 7, he said I was dreaming. I was on my bed, and I had this dream in my head. Remember how it described it that way? Here it's actually called a vision. So it's a little different. All the others, everything before that were all dreams too. This is one that's actually, the first one that's actually called a vision, is here in chapter 8. I saw in the vision, and it so happened, I always like that, it so happened. In the context of God, nothing just so happens. God makes things happen the way He wants to, the way He's going to. And so it so happened while I was looking that I was in Shushan, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in the vision that I was by the river Ulai. And so we're going to talk about where that's at just briefly. I think I got a couple, yeah. So Babylon is where we're used to him talking, right? And this is where he lives, and this is where the vision's taking place. But he sees it as if he's over here in Elam. In Susa, you could actually, I don't know if I would recommend going there on a tour, but that's one of the castles or fortresses there in Susa that, of course, it's out of Iran. That's why I don't necessarily recommend anyway necessarily go over there in modern day Iran. But anyway, the bottom line is he's here, and so he sees himself in this vision. He's in Babylon, but he sees himself in this vision is what's going on there. So a couple of things that's I think interesting about that location. The book of Esther takes place there. right? We get to Esther and all the story that goes along there. And Nehemiah was King Artaxerxes' cupbearer, who also lived in that same region. So it's going to have a future for other Jews as well going forward. Okay, so he's got a vision. He sees himself standing there, and now he's going to see what does he see in the vision. Then I lifted up my eyes and saw, and there, standing beside the river, was a ram which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, but the one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. So they didn't all come up at the same time. Remember, like we talked about the bear. The bear's got his one back is pushed up higher than the other, meaning it's a composite of Media and Persia together, and the Persians were the stronger side, so it was uplifted up higher. So when it's talking about these horns, and the one that's bigger is referring to Persia, and the smaller one, of course, is referring to Media. So remember, these two are working together, conquering the world. Ultimately, becomes Persia that becomes the bigger and more powerful of the nations. Okay, so the horns of this ram did not grow up together, which is interesting, nor did they maintain the same greatness, because Persia was greater. But Medes actually had chronologically, time-wise, were older, but they never had the power that the Persians did. But working with the Persians, they look like they have a lot of power. But they, like I said, the Medes end up kind of fading out of the word of significance because the Persians overwhelm them and take over, become the dominant force. I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward so that no animal could withstand him. So animal in this case is any kind of nation or kingdom or anybody that's tried. No one can stop the Median Persians as they're moving forward and doing their things. Nor was there anyone that could deliver him from his hand, but he did according to his will and became great. Same kind of language we saw talking about Nebuchadnezzar. He did whatever he wanted to do. He was great, he was powerful, no one's going to stop him. And no human, it would appear, would be able to stop him, right? So Persia extended its empire westward, northward, and we'll see a map a little bit later, how it all looked. And south with a vast army. They had 2 million army. It was a pretty big army. I mean, to have 2 million people in your army is a big deal back then. So they were able to do a lot of conquering as a result, especially if it's organized and planned. And as I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from the west. Okay, so we got a ram. And it's the Media Persia, one horn bigger than the other. It's Persia and Media together. And they can do whatever they want. No one's able to stop them. And then he sees, then a male goat came from the west across the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground. Interesting phrase, without touching the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. A big notable horn between his eyes is what he sees. And so it's really, which is the picture you saw earlier, reversed. But you see that the horn is now referring to someone who's going to, the whole thing he wanted to say about Persia, he's now moving on to the next king right away, the kingdom that's going to take over the Medes and the Persians, and that's going to be Greece. So the male goat represented Greece, which is the third world empire. Remember, Babylon, Media Persia. Greece is taking over Media Persia. The first ruler of the Macedonian Empire was Philip of Macedon, but the greatest one was really his son, and the most notable one, which would be Alexander the Great, as he's known. And so the horn is actually a picture of representing the greatness of Alexander, and that comes out a little bit more as we go on. So he says he did this without touching the ground. The whole idea was that he moved so fast. It's like he's not saying he didn't touch the ground. These guys walked on water. No, they didn't walk in the air. They were very fast. When in fact, within 12 years, they went in and took over the vast areas of the Medes and the Persians. The Greeks did. So they very fast moving and very quick under the leadership of Alexander. So it's a figure of speech that they move very quickly. Then he came to the ram, which had the 2 horns, right, Media Persia, which I had seen standing beside the river, and ran at him with furious power. So the idea is he's just taking over the Medes and the Persians. That is, the Greeks are taking over the Medes and the Persians. In particular, Alexander is leading the charge, is what's happening here. So the picture here is he's going to come at them. That is the goat in Greece. And he's on the move, and he's going to come in, and he's going to stab and kill the ram, which is Medes, the Medes and the Persians. So there's a history there, because he talks about his fury. He came at him with furious power, right? And so there were some battles where the Medes and Persian had come before into Greece and had taken near Greece itself, Athens, and so several towns were taken over by the Medes and the Persians. So he had a vendetta against the Medes and the Persians. So what Alexander was going to do is make sure he took them over, destroyed them, and killed them, because he obviously had some loss there by the cities that had been taken previously. Verse 7, and I saw him confronting the ram, and he was moved with rage against him, attacked the ram, and broke his two horns, Medes and Persians it represents. There was no power in the ram to withstand him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him, and there was no one that could deliver the ram from his hand. Same kind of language he just said about the Medes and Persians. Now it's saying about the Greeks who just taken over the Medes and the Persians, and they've been going all throughout the region. So it said like this: the greatness that had characterized the ram now belongs to the goat. No one's able to stop them. They're on the move and they're on the prowl and they're taking over everything. So it says Alexander was enraged. And again, he mentions the battle at Salamis and Marathon. The battle of Marathon were things that had taken place just prior to, and he's getting even with the Medes and the Persians by destroying them with fury, is what he says there. Therefore, the male goat grew very great. The male goat is, in the horn in particular, is Alexander. But when Alexander, became strong, the large horn was broken, that big horn in the front there, and in place of it, 4 notable ones came up towards the 4 winds of heaven. So he's going to have the one big horn, which is Alexander, at the height of his power, dies. I mean, anyone knows the story, he died very suddenly, and he was I think 32 or 33 years old at the time, very young. So as soon as the goat was elevated, which is Greece, as soon as the goat was elevated to great power, the large single horn was broken off, and its place was taken by 4 prominent horns. And historically, we know they're the generals. For 12 years, they've been doing battle, these generals, and going here and going there and winning this territory and winning places all over the Middle East, right? So they're winning power, and then your commander-in-chief dies, and he doesn't have an heir. So Alexander dies, and he doesn't have an heir. So what happens is these guys say, well, I won all these areas over here. I'm just going to claim this area that I won is mine now. And so they ended up with 4 generals who were in charge of 4 regions in a vast, vast area. So kind of like, and actually, what it looks like. You got the Mediterranean Sea, you got Israel here and Babylon there. And so Greece covers really all this area. Cassander, Lysimachus, and those were 2 of the generals. And Ptolemy down in Egypt was pretty famous because they ended up having some battles between each other. The Greeks battling Greeks, right? But that happened. And then the largest is the Seleucus, and it also encompassed Jerusalem. That's important because of that guy there that comes out of Seleucus would be Antiochus Epiphanes, and we get there a little bit later. But to see the biggest portion of it was Seleucus, and it's just basically, like I said, 4 kings taking over the area, but there were still skirmishes between each other. Maybe some of the generals that had won some areas down here, but he was limited as to where they actually had control. Cassander would have been in Greece itself proper, the main country that we think of, but they had control over this vast area. Now, out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great towards the south, towards the east, and towards the glorious land, which would be west, because they're in the Babylon area region, and they're looking west would be looking into Jerusalem, right? So we got a little horn that's going to come out. This little horn becomes pretty important for this whole chapter. It's going to talk about this little horn that comes out. This is the kingdom of Syria. So let me go back to the map for a second. So, you got Israel, and you're going to have what we think of as Syria is you're going to be up here. But this whole region in this Seleucus area was actually considered Syrian in a lot of regards back then. Even though where we think of Syria now is geographically just north of Jerusalem, this whole region, the whole Seleucus area was actually considered Syrian. So this king, this is the kingdom of Syria, especially the one whose kings was one of the most vile and wicked men in history. Now, how do we know what Antiochus Epiphanes looked like? Well, he had coins. So this is actually a coin of Antiochus Epiphanes. So that's, I had seen some sculptures, and they may be as true as well. But what did he look like? But he was a very vile guy. He was a very bad guy. The reason he's kind of important in the book of Daniel is because whatever it's going to say about him is often very much exactly the same thing is going to happen with the Antichrist. He's a prefigure of what the Antichrist is going to be like. And so there's a correlation between it. So let's go on to verse 10. And it grew up to the host of heaven. This Antiochus Epiphanes grew in power. He's a Greek, but he's also a Syrian of descent. When they think about him today, they would say he's actually a Syrian descent. And it cast down some of the host and some of the stars to the ground and trampled them. In other words, he was a persecutor of Israel, and a big-time persecutor of Israel. And there's a lot of history behind him. He's about almost 7 years of just terror he brought upon Israel after they came back into the land. Right now, this is speaking future, because they're still in Babylon. And he's getting this vision of something that's going to happen in the future. I can imagine Daniel's all excited. We're going to be going back to the land soon. When you get to chapter 9, he's going to talk about that. And we know that 70 years is almost up. So this is good. But he's getting a vision that even when they get back in the land, bad things are going to happen to them. So you can see it's going to be a pretty devastating thing for Daniel. In fact, later on, he gets ill because he knows the time of this bondage in Babylon is going to go away, but the vision he has is, okay, the people are going to be in the land, but this bad guy, this little horn, is going to come up, and he's going to cause havoc for Israel. So it's going to be pretty bad. So anyway, he's basically the host. He's referring to the people, the Jewish people, and the persecution he's going to bring on them. He even exalted himself. Don't you love that? He's a legend in his own mind, right? He even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host. We're talking about, some people actually thought that might actually refer to like the high priest or something, but the prince of the host, I think, is referring to the Jesus, the Messiah, who's really their prince over all of Israel. He exalted himself as high as the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. The prince's sanctuary is cast down, is the picture. So just think about this whole image. They're in Babylon, they're in captivity, they're going to go eventually back to the land. The Medes and the Persians especially, are going to allow them. Cyprus is going to say, you can go. Cyrus is going to say, you can go back. In fact, we're going to pay for you to go back. They go back, and as the text is going to go in, because of their sinfulness, they got back into sin again, and then bad things will occur to them as a result of it. So Antiochus set himself up as Israel's king. Not just there, but all around that region, he was trying to take control, which is everything about leadership in the past. Seems like it's about who's got the biggest gun. We would say today, the guy with the biggest gun leads, right? Well, there would be a big army, and chariots or horses were all important to them. But so he was basically in charge of Jerusalem, and that wasn't a good thing because he hated them. So anyway, let's go on to verse 12. Because of the transgression, that's Israel's transgression, they got back in the land, they got the temple rebuilt, and all that goes with it, and things were good for a while. But as nature goes on, they eventually started getting into sin. Because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices. Meaning, God's bringing this person in specifically to stop the sacrifices. They're in sin, and they're doing these rituals and things that God told them to do, but they're not doing it with any of the right heart. So they're out of fellowship, right? And he cast truth down to the ground. He did all this and prospered. Yeah, that's one of those phrases where you say, why do the wicked seem to get away with everything? Well, they do. For a while, but not forever, right? Eventually, God's going to make it all right. So he cast down truth to the ground. He did all this, and he prospered as a bad, wicked guy. But God's the one, as he's saying here, who sent him because of their transgression. So you could say they deserved it, but that would be true of us too. So I don't want to say that, because a lot of times we mess up when we know we shouldn't mess up, right? So, okay. Israel again became corrupt, but one of the things that did happen when the Israelites went into Babylon, they never got back into idolatry. Do you ever notice that? That was the end. They were always in the idolatry up to that point. At this point, they get all kinds of other sins, but they never were worshiping idols and all that stuff again, even in the days of Jesus. They're not worshiping idols. They have the other issues and other sins, but they're not doing that. So the Babylonian captivity did kind of cure them from that aspect, from idolatry. Okay, and again, he's bringing Antiochus Epiphanes for a reason, because of their transgression. Verse 13, then I heard a holy one speaking, and he's referring to angels. There's going to be a couple angels involved here. I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that certain one who was speaking. So you got two, it's like he's hearing a conversation of two angels talking. And they said, how long will the vision be, right, concerning the daily sacrifices? So they're having a conversation about the daily sacrifices, and because he's saying that they're going to be stopped in the temple, and they're going to be under great persecution. They want to know, well, how long is that going to last? He doesn't. They don't want that to go on forever. And the transgression of desolation, which includes things like setting up a statue of Zeus in the temple. They offered pigs as sacrifice, which is not kosher, right? God said not to eat that. And he would do that, and he would force them to eat pig and all this stuff, the very thing that they was been appalling to them. This is what Antiochus Epiphanes made the people do. He was a tyrant in all regard. So concerning the daily sacrifice and the transgression of desolation, the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot, God gave them to do this to get their attention. I know God never has to do that for us, right? We always stay on the right path and never get off the side. He never has to thunk us on the head and go, what are you doing? I'm just saying that kind of tongue-in-cheek. Sometimes he has to get our attention. He really got their attention in a very vast way, in a very serious way, very scary way for them. So for Daniel's benefit, an angel called a Holy One addresses a revealing angel, so one's talking to the other, right, and asks how long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled. You would think Daniel would be the one to ask it, but no, this one angel's asking the other angel, who seems to know how long this is going to take place. The fact that he asked the question is good, because it now gives us an answer how long it's going to take place. How long until this condition will be corrected and the daily sacrifice be resumed according to the law? How long will they be in this dreadful condition is the question. So verse 14 is the answer. And he said to me, for 2,300 days, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. Now there's a verse for you, because you talk about prophecy craziness. The people take this verse and just as an example, it says how many days? It says days. If you're in certain denominations, they actually say, well, that means actually years. And so they go, was it 474 BC, and they go out 2,300 years, and they come out to 1844, and Jesus came at that time. Oh, wait a minute. We're past 1844, aren't we? Okay, maybe he didn't come at that time. But they say he did come. But what he did, he's now cleansing the sanctuary in heaven. As if the sanctuary in heaven needed cleansing, because it's holy, it's in the presence of God. Anyway, I'm I'm not trying to pick on that group, but that would be a group, for example, that takes Seventh-day Adventists, to be exact, are the ones who take this, 2,300 days and turn it into 2,300 years. The problem is it really was 2,300 days. They just sort of ignore the detail of it because they had to try to come up with an answer as to why. Remember, that was the great disappointment? They stood on the roofs, tops, waiting for Jesus to come, and he didn't come. Oh no, well now what do we got to do? So that's where this investigative judgment came in. That's what they call it. Where they take the 2,300 days and turn it into years and say, oh, we were right. Jesus did come. Not to the earth. He just moved to another compartment in the sanctuary in heaven, as the vision, as they describe it. It's pretty wild. So if you take the date when the temple was cleansed, which is pretty well known because of a Jewish holiday created because of it. If you take the date that the temple was cleansed and you go back, which was December 25th, 164 BC, Daniel's writing hundreds of years in advance here. This is why liberals hate the book of Daniel. Or they say he couldn't have written all this stuff because he couldn't have known all this stuff. Well, God did. And so if you count back 2,300 days, it comes back to when Antiochus began his persecution in earnest, when he came in and started to persecute them. So that whole time, and he stopped the sacrifices, would have been about 171 BC, to be exact. So through 164 is your whole period. It's a little over 6 years. 6 years and 2 months or 3 months or something, it works out, to be exact. But the point is, it's a historical event. We have timelines, when it began, when it ended, not to say that it's something that's way out, days become years. And so that doesn't make any sense at all. So the persecution of Antiochus lasted from September 6, 171 BC to December 25th, 164 BC, which is the Feast of Dedication. Hanukkah, John 10 talks about it. Jesus went to the Feast of Dedication, sometimes called the Feast of Lights. Or Hanukkah is what most people think of it as. It's all the same one. Because of this event that's known in history, the exact date, they have another a feast. It's not one of the 7 feasts of the Lord, but it's their own feast. And Jesus didn't seem to have any qualms with it. He seemed to participate in it. So it's just that one verse refers to it, but it's a natural event that took place in the past. It's not something that's going to happen or did happen in the future. I mean, from Daniel's standpoint it is, but certainly not future from our standpoint. Then it happened when I, Daniel, had seen the vision and was seeking the meeting that suddenly there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. So, he calls him a man. Doesn't say anything more than that, right? Of course, the word in the Hebrew it really means a mighty man, and it's oftentimes used for angels, and this is actually an angel. It's like Gabriel is who he's referring to. A couple of verses later, you see Gabriel is going to be mentioned. So he's talking to this mighty man who's actually an angel. He looks like a man, and Hebrews talks about people can entertain angels unaware, not even aware that it's really an angel, but they appear to be a human, and so we don't even know that. So from Daniel's standpoint, it was a man. He was a mighty man. So Gabriel is the one who explained that the vision pertained to the time of the end. As you see that in a couple of verses, he'll say that. It's the time of the end. So he's going to refer to Antiochus Epiphanes, but some of this is going to actually have a projection out in the future that hasn't still happened yet, because Antiochus is a picture of the Antichrist. So anyway, he's going to talk about the concerning the nation Israel under the Greek Empire. So I need to just jump on to verse 16 because we're explaining stuff, I think, good. And I heard a man's voice. He mentioned he saw a man. I heard a man's voice, which is not the same person. That man's voice we think was Gabriel, but it's a man's voice between the banks of the Eula, and called and said, Gabriel, that's why we think the man was Gabriel. Gabriel, make this man, Daniel, understand the vision. So a person, a voice of a man, speaks to Gabriel and says, tell Daniel what it all means, since you understand what's going on here. I think the man's voice is probably God speaking to Gabriel and saying, explain it to him, help him to understand. So it appears that the man's voice was God himself, speaking in a human voice. Of course, this is the first time an angel is actually mentioned in the Bible. It would be right here, would be for Gabriel. Although Michael's going to be mentioned pretty soon, coming up in the book of Daniel also, but it's the first time an angel is actually mentioned, is right there. So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid, and fell down on my face. But he said to me, understand, son of man, he's encouraging him, that the vision refers to the time of the end. So usually when you see that phrase, that time of the end, it is referring to something way out in the Daniel 70th week, way out in the future from our end. I don't think it does here. I think you see why. So that time of the end is the period defined by the empires, the Persian and the Greek, with the ram and the goat. When the Greek land holdings would be divided into 4 parts, you're referring to the part when all this is after Alexander dies, and they're now you got 4 kings, if you will, that are in charge, is what he's referring to, that part of the end. It really was kind of the end of them, because now they're so divided, even among themselves, the Greeks are, it was not hard for the Romans to come along. So let me talk about this. The Syrian under Seleucus will eventually lead Antiochus Epiphanes as he's actually known as the Little Horn. The Little Horn is Antiochus Epiphanes, a bad guy for Israel. But the secondary meaning has to do with the fact that the little horn here in Daniel chapter 8 is the same as the Antichrist in the future. He's the little horn that will come up and will subdue 3 kingdoms, remember, of the 10-nation confederation, and he kind of rules it all, right? So a secondary meaning of the little horn is the Antichrist of the future. So Antiochus equals future Antichrist. He's not the same guy, but he's a picture of him. Antiochus prefigures a later fulfillment. Both of them persecute the Jews, right, badly, in a bad time way, and both of them will stop the daily sacrifices, right? So what Antiochus did is exactly what the Antichrist would do in the future, in the middle of Daniel's 70th week, is when he breaks his agreement, he stops the sacrifices, exactly the same thing that we see here. And so part of what's significant is, but this guy is a Syrian/Greek, right? And he is the guy who pictures the Antichrist. So that's part of the reason why I'm saying the 4th kingdom may not actually be Rome itself. And we'll go into some of that, especially in chapter 11, as to who it is. But the traditional view is that it is Rome. Now, as he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground, but he touched me and stood me upright. So this is an event we see all the time. People get around angels, they just can't help themselves. It's like they faint, they fall down, they're overwhelmed because they can tell what great power they have, and I don't know if there's a glow to them or whatever that goes with it. But the bottom line is he was pretty upset with it. He couldn't control himself. So while Daniel was still prostrate on the ground, Gabriel came over, restored him, and said, I got a message for you. I'm supposed to tell you something. You can't be on your face while I tell it to you. Let's help him up so we can talk to him in a nice way. Verse 19, and he said, look, I am making known to you what shall happen in the latter time of the indignation. So he's adding that extra phrase, not just latter time of the indignation, for at the appointed time the end shall be. So he's still answering the question. How long before all this takes place? The 2,300 days. He's giving him a little bit of an answer to it. There's a more specific item added. Okay, the fact that it's not just the time of the end, but the time of indignation. This is a terrible persecution for the Jews at the time. So the vision ended at the final downfall and death of Antiochus. So the vision ends when Antiochus dies. And everybody thinks, well, that's a good thing when he dies because of all that went on. It's really what he's referring to. The end of Antiochus, he will die. Just like in the end, the Antichrist will be judged and he'll go into the lake of fire, right? Whose wicked conduct provoked the indignation of God. So God provoked it. God started it. He sent Antiochus to judge, just like same thing he did with the Babylonians, right? They're already while Daniel's seeing this, he's actually still in Babylonian captivity, And he's got a vision of something that's going to happen in the future. And again, Israel's going to mess up again. And God's going to have to bring somebody else along to get their attention, to bring judgment on them, right? So, though this prophecy is fulfilled in Antiochus Epiphanes, which is an interesting name, his real name is Antiochus IV. Epiphanes means exalted one. He gave him that name. I think we talked about this before. Antiochus, the great one, is what he called himself. Now, he can't be just Antiochus IV, the son of Antiochus III, which he is. He's Antiochus IV. He's now Antiochus the great one. He also has a later fulfillment as Antichrist. That's the point of this, because he's not just a historical event. A little bit after, a couple hundred years after Daniel, he's also somebody that's going to be a good example of what it looks like when the Antichrist himself comes. So the ram which you saw, having two horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia. Does that make it any more plain? Remember, he makes it very plain. The ram that had the two horns, and one of the horns was really big and one was kind of mediocre, right? That's the Persians and the mediocre and the Medias. And so he very much names them. And of course, in Daniel chapter 2, when Nebuchadnezzar saw the image, he said, "You, O king, are that head of gold." So he told him that the Babylonians were that. And then he's going to go on, verse 21, and the male goat, because he's giving the meaning to Daniel, and the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. The large horn that is between his eyes is the first king, or the greatest king. They actually had a king before, but he wasn't so as great, as well known, of course, as Alexander the Great. So he gives you the names Greece and Media Persia as the meaning, but you're going to notice that when it comes down to that next kingdom, the fourth kingdom, it's never called Rome. It doesn't actually, and it gives description of him, but it's really referring to what it's going to be like in the future more than anything. I think that's kind of important. So the single horn represented Greece's greatest king, Alexander. And I mentioned that Philip II in Macedonia had united a lot of the Greek city-states. He did a lot of uniting. Alexander wasn't into uniting. He was into conquering. In those 12 years, he went everywhere and everywhere. And like I said, for 12 years, he conquered. And he's like 33 years old. And he dies. There's a whole lot of story as to why, and alcohol was part of it. But he was a pretty messed up guy, to say the least. But Alexander is considered Greece's first a great king. It depends on, when you go back to the map, that region had people living there for years, way before this time. But as far as a nation, as a region, Alexander would certainly be the greatest. And at his prime is when he died, right? And as for the broken horn and the four that stood up in its place, so the one big horn is broken, and then four come out of it, is the idea. 4 kingdoms shall rise out of that nation, but not with its own power. Meaning it's not because they have such a great power. A lot of what they gain is because of what Alexander gained, right? And all the regions they gained, they just kind of like by default, okay, I'm in charge of this now. Well, that was all because of what Alexander and his leadership was brought about. So now they're taking charge of something that really wasn't by their own power, right? So Alexander died at age 33, and in 323 BC. He had nobody to take over. And so as a result, these 4 kingdoms, as we saw that map earlier, were actually 4 generals that had taken over the rule. So the divided kingdom of Greece never had the same power that Greece enjoyed under Alexander. But it was only for a short time with Alexander, but he had great power at the time that he was out conquering. That's all he basically is known as a conqueror. And he moved very swiftly and very fast as he went through conquering nations. And in the latter time of their kingdom, not latter time in the future, like the 70th week of Daniel, not talking about that. We're talking about of their kingdom, the Greek kingdom. When the transgressors have reached their fullness, a king shall arise, having fierce features, who understands sinister schemes. Sounds like a nice guy. He's referring again now to Antiochus again. He's actually referring back to him because he's going to be a bad guy. He's going to have fierce features. He understands sinister schemes. And so it's the end of the Greek Empire, but he's referring to as it relates to Israel, who's in charge of Israel at the time? Well, the Greeks, and it was Antiochus Epiphanes. And he's just known as a great deceiver in most of the things he did. So this idea of this ram or this goat with 4 horns kind of represents, each horn represented each of the 4 kings, the 4 regions of the Greek when it was broken up. The fierce feature seems to define he had a harshness of his face, is the idea that, having fierce features seems to give the idea he's kind of an intimidating, scary kind of a guy to look at. He was an expert in matters of trickery and would not hesitate to use it to his own advantage. I know everyone just said, well, that sounds like our politicians. But anyway, well, he would be no different than that, right? I mean, use anything to their advantage, he'd be right there. The near fulfillment views Antiochus as the historical persecutor, right? That's what he's referring to. His career extended to 164 BC in the latter time of their kingdom, basically near the end of their kingdom. Greek's kingdom before the Rome comes in, right, and takes over. And that of the male goat of the Syrian territory. Again, Syrian is emphasized because a lot of times they're called in that region, in that Seleucid region of Greece. Greece is its own place, but they conquered a lot of territory. So he's actually referring to the Syrian part of the territory. His power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. Earlier we talked about that same idea that he gained it because of Alexander's strength and all that, but not by his own power. He shall destroy fearfully. Right? He's going to be a bad guy. He shall prosper and thrive. He shall destroy the mighty and also the holy people. The emphasis on the holy people, because Daniel's always concerned about his own people, right? And rightfully so. And so he's talking about what he's going to be like, especially to the Jews. He's going to be dreadful and terrible and very hard to them. Verse 25. Through his cunning, he shall cause deceit to prosper. Again, we're talking politics again here, right? I mean, people that seem to deceive everybody into one thing, and they know they mean this, but they're going to tell them this, and they seem to win for now. He did win with his deceit. He did seem to prosper for a while under his rule. And he shall exalt himself in his heart, right? He's a legend in his own mind, right? Everybody gets that ego thing. He shall destroy many in their prosperity, their property, the land, all that goes with it. He shall even rise against the prince of princes. Anytime that's used in the book of Daniel, that seems to be referring to the Messiah himself, Jesus. Now, I don't think he knows Jesus, but he's referring to God and the Messiah in particular. He shall even rise against the prince of princes. Well, who else is going to do that? Well, the Antichrist. I mean, exactly. 2 Thessalonians 2, verses 3 and 4. He will sit in the temple of God proclaiming that he is God, right? And all that goes with it. He's basically saying, I'm God, and there is no other God. But he shall be broken without human means. In the end, God's going to judge him. But for a while, he's going to bring a lot of havoc on the Jews as they get back into the land. We get all excited when we get to Ezra and Nehemiah, and we see them building the wall, and then the temple gets built and all that. And by 515 BC, they actually have a temple, and that's all good. But just a couple of years after that, there's going to be they're going to be losing it again. They're going to have a hard time. But what we're saying here is Antiochus Epiphanes, but we're also saying it's exactly true for the Antichrist in the future. So this is referring to a picture of what it's going to be like in the future as well. It's going to be exactly like that with the Antichrist. He would devastate property, destroy people in order to expand his kingdom. Whoever I got to hurt, it doesn't matter. If they're in my way, I'm going to hurt them as long as I keep expanding my power, is what he's saying. So Antiochus was broken without human means due to, he went insane and he died of some issue with his bowels. I mean, no one took him over. God either sent this plate on him, and he went crazy. And sometimes when you think people are just insane, when they're just persecuting and hurting people, they're already insane. Well, he went so insane that he ended up dying through it. So Antiochus would be destroyed by supernatural power. I believe that's what he means here. God's the one doing it. His rise was not of his own doing. Ultimately, again, because it was Alexander that brought all this power to be. And his downfall was not by human means. He died in Persia 164 BC. So that's important. And so, like I said, as it relates to him, because of him, the Jews have another holiday that they celebrate in around Christmas time, and the Feast of Hanukkah. So Rome conquered Greece in 146 BC, a little bit after Antiochus Epiphanes died. Only a few years later, Rome became the dominant. But again, Rome's never mentioned specifically in Daniel. It's just the next chronological kingdom. So most going down the line of the image would typically thought that it would refer to Rome. And there's some challenges to that, but we'll get into that, especially in chapter 11. And the vision of the evenings and mornings, which was told is true, therefore seal up the vision, for it refers to many days in the future. Now, is he referring to just the time of Daniel, who's in Babylon, just referring to a couple hundred years later, or way out in the future, even from us? I think actually both are true. The morning and evenings, referring back to that 2,300 days, it's actually the same phrase. 23 when it says days, it's actually the same phrase as morning and evenings, and that caused some people to think that it's not really 2,300 days, but half of that. But it doesn't fit, because they take the morning sacrifice and the evening sacrifice, which they did every day, 2 of them, right? And so you take 2 of those. So you take the 2,300 days and you cut it in half. It doesn't fit. There's a number of people to do that. I said, well, this just means the morning sacrifices and the evening sacrifices, and so it's only referring to half that number. I don't think God's trying to confuse anyone. When he says 2,300 days, he meant 2,300 days exactly as it says it. So you're going to seal up the vision, kind of like saying protect it, because you're going to read this. We get the chance to read it today, right? Because he did. For it refers to many days in the future. So, and then the last verse here, in verse 27, and I, Daniel, fainted and was sick for days. Now, I don't know, when we see this, maybe we're just so used to movies and so used to getting crazy, watching wild, incredible things take place. But Daniel saw this kind of stuff, and it really got to him. He got sick over it when he saw, especially his people going through a hard time still yet in the future, while he's still in Babylon at the time, in captivity, right? Afterward, I arose and went about the king's business, meaning he wasn't able to do the work. Remember, he's a representative, and so the king, Belshazzar in this case, right, instead of Babylon. So he wasn't able to do it because he was sick for a few days, so he had to take a couple of days sick leave, right? But then he got better, and so he was able to do the king's business. And he says, I was astonished by the vision, but no one understood it. So meaning he didn't fully get what he was writing. Just like Daniel, or I should say John writing the book of Revelation, didn't always understand everything he was writing also, and likewise Daniel did not. But he was pretty bothered by it. You know, do you get bothered by the thought that our country, it seems like, you know, when we talk about America in prophecy, well, it's not in prophecy. There's no reference to America in prophecy. And that's just some of these interesting guys who twist things and do some pretty wild gymnastics to say that we're Ephraim and UK is anyway, they go through the different tribes and they try to associate tribes with different countries, and they try to say, but the point is America's not in prophecy. Let me just give an example of something that's kind of unique. I don't know if anyone's watching what's going on in Iran. I don't mean the potential war and stuff. You ever watch the Euphrates River, or back in Iraq I should say, the Euphrates River is dried up. Have you seen that the last couple of weeks? It's been going on for years, and there's a number of Bible teachers going out there and say, "See, we're in the wrath of God," and all that. Well, because the trumpet, it is going to dry up, but that's completely different. We won't even be around when that takes place. That's in the future. But they're just taking one isolated event, the drying up of the Euphrates, and they're saying, "Look, these are the last days," and you know, preaching sermons and all this stuff on this stuff is pretty sad, because it takes things out of context and makes for maybe a sensational message, but it's not true. Is that people, we have great imaginations, but we don't need to use our imagination. We just need to believe the text by faith and allow the Holy Spirit to guide us. Don't take things from the Scriptures and do weird things with it. People do that all the time. It's an interesting story because even unbelievers are talking about the drying up of the Euphrates. There's another context, actually going back to the Nile River. That's another conversation as well. That's a real issue for them as well. But right now, the Euphrates have been drying up for years, and it's basically almost, well, you can walk around most of it, walk across it now. It's pretty bad. It's really in bad shape. I just say that that should astonish us to a point, but it's not prophetic, I don't think, that when it really dries up, the future, it will happen in the future, and the armies will come from the east over, and they will come for the Battle of Armageddon, and all that will take place in the future. That's true. But anyway, he was pretty well overworked by it. It bothered him, and he got sick over it, and he fainted through it, just thinking about how significant this is. So anyway, Daniel was completely overwhelmed. Not only exhausted, he was ill, and just the little interpretation he was given about these nations that are going to rise up afterwards really bothered him. I think because of his love for his people, for Israel, and seeing what's going to go on for them still yet in the future. Father, thank you again for this night. Thank you for all that your word teaches us. In the end, it tells us that you're in control. Not just telling the near future events, but the future events that are thousands of years later, Father. And we just know that you got it all under control, and that gives us great consolation to know that all the things that go on in our lives, sometimes they can seem to be overwhelming, but Father, you got them under control as well, even the small things. So, Father, knowing that, we take consolation. So, Father, thank you. Help us to grow closer to you. Help us to grow in faith as the days seem to get darker. In Jesus' name. Amen.